As gaming's popularity continues to increase, so does its accessibility. Tutorials that can take hours to complete, frequent checkpoints, as well as quicktime events that solely require the player to quickly tap a button. Those are all design choices that can be found in many, if not most, modern games, and they don't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. Oddly enough, some titles, such as From Software's Souls games, completely ignore those aspects and go into the exact opposite direction. When it comes to this truly interesting take on modern game design, those games' horror-themed spiritual successor Bloodborne isn't any different, and even though it does have some flaws, it's still a beautifully challenging experience no PlayStation 4 owner should miss out on. As I already pointed out, Bloodborne indeed shares a couple of similarities with the Souls games, and while it does introduce some new ideas, Dark Souls players will most likely soon feel at home after stepping into the world of Bloodborne. This is probably related to the core gameplay experience of carefully planning your actions and having to commit to an animation once it's been triggered that can be found in the Souls series still being intact, along with the fact that the punishing difficulty the franchise is known for is as present as ever. However, instead of being set in a medieval castle, Bloodborne throws players into a 19th century-ish town called Yharnam that is filled with werewolves as well as creepy people worshipping the moon. You step into the role of a so-called hunter, and while the game never really tells you why, you're one of about 3 people who go out hunting for werewolves, snake men, and other filthy creatures, while others either tend to turn into evil monsters themselves or simply hide in their houses. This sense of mystery helps add to the overall desolate atmosphere Bloodborne is trying to create. Furthermore, the constant feeling of danger the Souls series managed to convey can be felt even more strongly in Bloodborne, which is probably related to its truly outstanding setting as well as its insanely creative enemy design that makes even the weakest enemies seem intimidating. The solid visuals, as well as the stellar art direction, also do their part in making the game's world seem fresh, terrifying, and most of all, believable. While the game's emphasis on a dark color palette, as well as bleak landscapes, can seem monotonous at times, and distant objects often look blurry and washed out, Bloodborne's overall aesthetic premise of making you feel like a part of an unforgiving nightmare is masterfully executed and manages to increase the immersion even more. Its cutscenes are also used rather scarcely, and encounters with characters who don't immediately want to murder you in first sight don't happen really often. The game's story does fall a bit short though. I know that this lack of information and interaction is supposed to make players feel lost and helpless, but I can't help but wish the game offered a little more insight into its world, as well as a more engaging story, especially when it comes to its ending. It also doesn't help that characters' lips don't move outside of cutscenes, which just seems completely out of place in a game of the current generation of consoles.
Oh, now let's think up some. Just tell me what piques your interest.
Bloodborne's unique setting and atmosphere aren't the only things that differentiate it from the Souls games though. While the controls, albeit streamlined, as well as the difficulty level are mostly similar to what can be found in the Souls games, its combat is a lot faster paced and will probably take former Souls players some time to get used to. There's actually only a single, rather weak shield in the game, which encourages players to tackle situations in a much more aggressive manner. Additionally, health can be regained for a short period of time by hitting an enemy, making an aggressive playstyle even more effective. Interestingly, the faster paced nature of Bloodborne's combat also takes away some of the frustration that was usually the result of an untimely death in the Souls games. While the more aggressive combat system naturally also causes you to die a lot faster, slicing through hordes of annoying, smaller enemies is something that can be done a lot more quickly as well, and as a result, getting back to the location of your death is made a lot less annoying. Besides that, it helps that leveling up, fast traveling, as well as upgrading and repairing your weapons can now all be done in one and the same place, the so-called Hunter's Dream, that you can access using small lamps, Bloodborne's version of bonfires. However, not all design choices made here lead to a more streamlined and less frustrating experience. When traveling back to the Hunter's Stream after activating a checkpoint, your potions, so-called blood vials, aren't restored, which forces you to farm for them in low-level areas. I can't recall how many times I had to do this before fighting a hard boss, and I actually don't even want to know how many hours I've lost simply killing the same weak enemies in the same area over and over again. This might sound like a mere annoyance at first, but it actually becomes much more of a problem when looking upon Bloodborne's main premise of everything in its world making sense and constantly providing you with a hard challenge, which this aspect of its design simply contradicts. Furthermore, I still don't see the point in not placing checkpoints directly in front of the actual boss fights, and thereby requiring players to either run from enemies for minutes or kill countless amounts of enemies they have already encountered and most likely killed before. Other than to make players search for hidden paths that are a little closer to the boss arena, there's literally no reason for this, although it is an aspect of a problem as it was in the previous Souls games. The bosses themselves, especially the ones that appear once you've beaten about half of the bosses in the game, are really tough foes. Luckily, you don't have to approach these excellently designed fights all on your own. Just like in the Souls series, you're able to summon other players to help you defeat even the fiercest enemies. However, since enemies don't get any stronger should you decide to get some help, most fights, save for the final boss battle, can get a little too easy when calling another player to your aid. Bloodborne's wonky camera, on the other hand, almost seems to be willing to encourage the players to take on bosses online, since its weird twists and turns make dying when facing a giant boss a lot more likely, and tends to act especially strange when you're locked onto a bigger enemy. While the groundbreaking way in which the camera suddenly turns around to fixate walls or rocks does make for some beautiful vistas at times, I can't help but wish it always focused on the actual boss fight instead. Apart from those issues, there isn't really a problem with Bloodborne's challenging boss fights though, and the feeling of accomplishment that follows after emerging victorious is nothing short of amazing. Besides amazing boss battles, Bloodborne also features a huge Metroidvania-style world that can be fully explored, if you can make it past the bosses that is. That world is crammed with secret chests and treasures, and gets more and more interconnected the more you play. Additionally, you'll often stumble across locked doors or even completely hidden paths that can later be accessed using keys or other objects you're able to obtain later in the game. However, it would be great if exploring those areas sometimes resulted in a bigger reward. For example, I kept using the armor set I found about 45 minutes into the game until the credits rolled, since I simply wasn't able to find anything that really improved my stats over the course of the entire game. I realized that this is a conscious design choice made by the developers and that the game wants you to focus on improving your weapons and stats instead, but finding something apart from stat improving runes and gems would have definitely encouraged me to explore even more. Besides its vast world, Bloodborne also features some additional, procedurally generated dungeons that are filled with bosses, puzzles, and all sorts of nasty creatures, so-called chalice dungeons. Just like in the streets of Yharnam, death lurks around every corner in there, and they're every bit as immersive as the world outside of them. What does hold the immersion back though, in Yharnam as well as the chalice dungeons, is the dumb AI of some enemy types. While bosses mostly have certain attack patterns they never really stray away from, some of the smaller enemies seem to have a weird affection for walls and running against them, which might also be related to the fact that they can even manage you to hit through solid objects if you stand close enough to one of them. There are also more than a few glitches in the game, and even one seemingly buggy boss fight towards the end of Bloodborne's 30 to 40 hour campaign, although I do believe that sad length might also be partially due to the game's atrocious loading times that can even take up to 40 seconds. Minus those smaller issues, however, there isn't really much to complain about, especially regarding the way Bloodborne's world is constructed. Bloodborne's attempt to focus on traditional aspects of game design and trusting the player sure is a risky one that takes a lot of guts and skill to pull off properly. However, except for some minor design problems, it actually succeeds on almost all levels. Given that Bloodborne even manages to improve upon the excellent foundation that has been laid by the Souls games, only makes this more commendable, and while it still has a steep learning curve, it does add just enough new elements to make the core gameplay more accessible without actually sacrificing any of the challenge that Souls games are known for. If you've always waited for an opportunity to jump on the Souls train, there's literally no better time than now. Let the hunt begin.